who would you be? What if you could choose from 1,000 yesterdays, when the past was today and the new took your breath away? Who would you be? How would you live? Who would you love? Living every generation before us, remembering for generations to come. The History Channel, where the past comes alive.
U.S. Navy's Third Fleet confronts a killer typhoon.
It was so extremely strong that you could not face it. It was just pelting in force.
2,000-ton ships are tossed about the ocean like bathtub toys.
It would shudder and shake and wobble back and forth the whole time it was rising up out of that wave, and then bang down again.
Not all ships survive the storm.
Here I was by myself in the middle of the South Pacific, hanging in a life jacket, wondering what's going to happen next.
I never thought I had a chance of making it in that water.
Dawn crept ominously over the horizon on December 17, 1944, as savage winds gathered strength across the South Pacific. Torrential rain and mammoth waves pounded the sturdy ships of the U.S. Navy's Third Fleet.
The wind was howling, and it was driving spray and rain horizontally, so that if you faced into it, it cut your face.
Sailors struggled to hang on as the USS Dewey ricocheted off 60-foot walls of water.
The ship would rise out of the wave and slam down into it with such an impact that it made you think that it was possible that it would break it in half.
As the storm tore through the region, the sailors got a crash course in battling an enemy more treacherous than the Japanese. The Third Fleet was being ambushed by a killer typhoon. A typhoon is the Pacific's version of a hurricane, a spiraling mass of wet, gusting air that gathers speeds up to 150 miles an hour, bringing with it blinding rains and punishing winds.
The eye is the most intense part of a tropical cyclone, and so that's where the most intense winds and the most intense seas are created. It's like a big vacuum cleaner, and in that eye, there's a big, giant sucking sound, and that low pressure is what causes the intensity of the storm, the intensity of the winds, and the concomitant intensity and height of the seas.
Typhoons are one of the strongest forces of nature on the planet. A typhoon has a huge extent. Their effects can be felt over 800 miles away, and it can be over many, many days.
Most typhoons sputter and die out before reaching killer status. But if conditions are right, a typhoon will slowly pick up power and momentum until it explodes upon the ocean. 90 fighting ships of the Third Fleet were on a collision course with just this kind of typhoon. And Admiral William Bull Halsey didn't see it coming. Born on October 30th, 1882, William Halsey seemed destined for glory. He entered the U.S. Naval Academy in 1900, and a brilliant military career was launched. Halsey was revered for his victories at Guadalcanal and Leyte Gulf. General Douglas MacArthur considered him to be the greatest fighting admiral of the war.
Bull Halsey really was an icon to us. We were really enthralled with the guy. He had a heart for his sailors, and we knew that. The word was out that Halsey was a sailor's sailor.
He was the kind of a guy that always wanted to get out there and get them.
His first message to the fleet was, One word: attack.
By the fall of 1944, U.S. forces were waging a ferocious battle against the Japanese in the Philippines. Halsey and his men were taking a beating from kamikaze bombers.
The kamikaze was in effect the first guided missile, only using a human pilot as the guidance system.
The bomb hit you, along with the plane itself. It was pure hell.
By December, Halsey was determined to rebound. General MacArthur ordered Admiral Halsey to provide the air support vital to regaining control of the Philippine Islands.
He desperately needed this air support, and Halsey, above everything else, felt that that was his main mission, to provide that air support.
Halsey accepted this job with characteristic gusto. He helped devise a plan nicknamed the Big Blue Blanket after the Navy football team. The strategy was for the Third Fleet to support MacArthur's ground troops by covering or blanketing all enemy air installations on the Philippine island of Luzon with round-the-clock air raids. On December 9th, 1944, the Third Fleet anchored at an island about 1,200 miles from Luzon, prepared for battle. The Third Fleet was an imposing force as it cruised into the Philippine Sea. Much of the fleet was made up of inexperienced but fiercely patriotic young sailors.
These were young men, many of whom were absolutely incensed over the attack on Pearl Harbor. They wanted to support their country.
These kids who came from all walks of life and all strata of society, no matter whether rich or poor, they all went in there and they did a great job.
22-year-old Patrick Douhan was one of 263 men who made his home aboard the destroyer, the USS Hull.
After Pearl Harbor, I felt it was my duty to join the Navy and go to war for my country.
As chief quartermaster on the Hull, Archie DeRykere's duties included setting all clocks on board, bringing him in contact with everyone from the officers on the bridge to the enlisted men down below.
They used me as their walking newspaper. They'd like to know what was going on up in the bridge. What's the latest scoop? Hey, Archie, what's going on?
Ray Schultz, chief boatswain mate who had survived Pearl Harbor, was in charge of ordering supplies for the ship.
I issued everybody a new life jacket, and we ordered whistles and lights, one-cell flashlights, to go with the jackets.
To help diffuse the tension about the dangerous mission that lay ahead, sailors in the Third Fleet were also given a chance for a little rest and relaxation at their home base, Ulithi Atoll.
Sunshine, blue sky, smooth water. Ulithi was the place where we relaxed, for what little relaxation there was.
What recreation we could get out of it, we did. They had what we called Iron City beer. We understood it had a little formaldehyde in it to make sure that it didn't spoil. And after we'd have a beer party, all of us had a little formaldehyde in us, too.
But as the men of the Third Fleet prepared to sail, forces of nature were conspiring to cause a catastrophe unlike any mortal enemy could inflict. And Admiral Halsey's winning combat record would do little to prepare him for the terrifying battle that lay ahead. On December 10th, 1944, Bull Halsey's Third Fleet sailed into the Philippine Sea. Its mission, to help General Douglas MacArthur reclaim the Philippines. For the next few days, they cruised into formation and prepared for battle. The weather was overcast, but the seas were fairly calm. When dawn broke on December 14th, the fleet had sailed into their ocean position 200 miles northeast of Manila. They were ready to provide air cover for the tiny island of Mindoro. Admiral Halsey's command echoed through the loudspeakers. Pilots, man your planes.
He was possessed with the overriding necessity of getting the aircraft in the air to deliver their weapons against targets selected by MacArthur.
For the next 3 days and nights, the men of the Third Fleet suppressed the deadly kamikazes and dropped bombs on enemy hangars.
The air support had proved to be very effective, and MacArthur hadn't been able to make the landings he planned on Mindoro and establish the fields that he wanted to establish for ground support.
Bull Halsey was ready to prepare for the next attack on Luzon. On December 16th, as the victorious ship sailed east to their rendezvous point for refueling, a tropical disturbance was gaining speed, power, and moisture over the open seas. Halsey was unaware of this approaching danger.
By modern standards, they were really operating in the dark. Weather satellites didn't exist. They had not established a technique of weather aircraft and weather surveillance by aircraft, and so they had to make judgment calls.
As a matter of fact, it was sometimes luck of the draw that a plane returning from mission would see weather.
That's exactly what happened on December 17th. As the storm moved closer and the weather began to deteriorate, one of the fleet's search pilots spotted the storm from his plane and sent a report to Halsey's flagship, the USS New Jersey. Since weather data was considered tactical information, the message had to go through a lengthy decoding process. The report didn't reach Admiral Halsey in time. He was leading his fleet straight into the storm. The smaller vessels, such as destroyers, were at greatest risk.
Destroyers are called tin can because they have a lot of armor but not much armament. They're very light, they're made for speed.
They're 300 feet long. That sounds like a pretty big ship, but compared to some of the other ships we were operating with, we're pretty small.
By early morning on December 17th, the so-called tin cans were being bounced around at the mercy of the heavy winds and waves as they tried and failed to refuel. Refueling is vital in bad weather because the weight of the fuel helps keep the ship stable. By 11 a.m., the seas were getting rougher and the barometric pressure was falling rapidly.
And when it starts dropping, you've got a problem. The storm is near. That's the warning. And when the bottom started dropping out of it, we all said, uh-oh, there she goes.
Bull Halsey was perched on his post aboard the New Jersey, trying to balance the considerations of weather and military maneuvers. Archie DeRykere and his shipmates on the hull waited for official word to take precautions. They were surprised when it didn't come.
Other ships had determined that we were in the path of a typhoon, and they couldn't understand why COM Third Fleet did not take action to avoid it.
That struck us as something that was peculiar and almost unbelievable. When we could see, as plain as day, that the weather was not going to improve, it was going to get far worse.
Halsey had to weigh the options.
A challenge, I think, for he and the battle staff was to make decisions that not only kept the safety of the fleet in mind, but also the fact that they were supposed to be dropping bombs on target.
Halsey persisted with the command to refuel and stay in formation. Individual ship captains started to prepare for the worst. Charles Calhoun was a 31-year-old graduate of the Naval Academy from Philadelphia and captain of the USS Dewey.
I had been told by my favorite executive officer, if you're encountering weather where the barometer falls at a rate of 0.03 inch per hour or greater, you're encountering a typhoon and you had better, in his quaint phrase, haul ass, unquote.
Captain Calhoun knew it was time to take care of his ship before all else.
We moved everything that could be moved from stations high in the ship to stations low in the ship, with the idea that everything we could reduce or lower into the bottom of the ship would improve our stability.
Just a mile away from the Dewey, Henry Plage, the 29-year-old captain of the USS Tabarer, gave his sailors the order to prepare their ship for severe conditions.
We told them to batten down all hatches, is the general term. With stormers approaching, take all precautions. And they had been trained in what to do in those situations, and so they did it.
By the time the sailors of the hull tried to take action, it was too late. The storm was hitting them at full force.
And that night, it was pure havoc on the bridge. The waves were so great, and the wind was at such a high velocity that the rain, it would just about cut your skin. It would coming down at such a force.
The ship was plunging pretty badly and up and down motion and starting to roll pretty badly. When I arrived up on the second deck and stepped out behind the chart house, I realized that the starboard side of the ship was submerged. It was actually awash. And the ladder, the starboard ladder to go to the bridge, was awash. I said, good Lord, we're really laying over.
By midnight, the Third Fleet was cruising into the eye of one of the most destructive storms to ever hit the U.S. Navy. Finally, at 8 o'clock the next morning, Halsey informed General MacArthur that refueling was impossible. Halsey's fleet would not be able to provide cover for MacArthur on December 19th. The first priority was to avoid what was now clearly a deadly typhoon. By the morning of December 18th, 1944, a typhoon was ripping through the U.S. Navy's Third Fleet in the Philippine Sea. Planes on aircraft carriers were torn from their steel davits, crashing into each other and catching fire. Ships rolled and pitched as mountains of water enveloped their decks. Charles Calhoun remembers hearing the worried crew members of the Dewey out on the open bridge reciting the words of the Navy hymn.
Eternal Father, strong to save, whose arm doth bound the restless wave, oh, hear us when we cry to thee for those in peril on the sea.
Then Captain Calhoun made a critical decision. He abandoned attempts at getting back into fleet formation.
I had a squadron commander aboard who also happened to be the screen commander in command of all the destroyers in that unit. So I was able to simply turn to him and say, Commodore, I'm concerned about my ship, and I'm just going to save the ship. And he said, I agree with you. The skippers of some of the other destroyers didn't have that privilege.
The USS Hull was one of those unlucky ships. The morning of the 18th, conditions aboard the Hull were unmerciful. Second-class Petty Officer Pat Douhan was up on the bridge in the afterdeck house trying to hold on.
Just hanging on for dear life because the ship was rolling at such a rate, and the waves, when they'd break over the bow, they'd come clear up practically over the bridge. And a destroyer being a small craft like that, why, you're at the mercy of the elements.
Waves were pouring onto her decks while the rolls submerged entire sides of the ship. Supply Officer Ray Schultz was up on deck as the wind velocity approached 100 knots. The ship pitched and rolled wildly.
All you can do is hang on to anything close by. You just grab and hang on to it till the ship come back up.
With zero visibility and unrelenting rain, the hull suffered electrical failures. As the destroyer withstood her body blows, she lost radar, radio, and shortly before noon, steering capabilities. The hull was now rolling at 70-degree angles.
Each time you think, well, this is the last time it's going over. Then something would happen and a wave would push it back up.
Pat Douhan struggled to get on deck and grab a life jacket.
When I came out of the compartment, where there was a life jacket hanging out of a gun, a spare life jacket hung on a gun, and I put it on.
The ship steadied momentarily. Then came a huge gust of wind that forced her to her starboard side at a nearly 90-degree angle. Water poured into her hull and superstructure. Just after 12 noon, the 1,400-ton destroyer surrendered to the sea and capsized.
A wave swept me up there just after I slipped that life jacket on, and the ship was on its side then. And then a few minutes later, while I was swept clear of the ship.
Of the 263 sailors aboard the hull, as many as 100 were trapped below decks. They went down with the ship.
I remember Bruno, Joe, John Tom, Dickie. The good friends that I do.
Men in the water felt the shudder of the USS Hull as she sank.
I felt the ship explode on me. I mean, you could feel the pressure. And then I was by myself.
The ship sunk right under us, just dropped down below us. And as it sunk, the suction took us down pretty deep. I recall my ears hurt pretty bad.
With their ship gone, the men were left alone to battle the elements. Some had made it into lifeboats. Others, including Ray Schultz, were washed into the sea with only life vests to help keep them afloat.
Big wave just beats the tar out of you. It just threw you around like just like a ball or cork. Threw you and just beat you up and down.
The wind during the typhoon was so extremely strong that you could not face it. It was just pelting in force. I mean, just like somebody throwing sand in your face. Terrific sandblaster.
Between the heavy rain and the tumultuous sea, the sailors were completely disoriented.
When you go down deep, you don't know which way's up. I mean, you start swimming as half-fast as you can to get to the surface. And if you come up in a trough, well, you get another one. But if you come up on the peak of a wave, then you shoot up out of the water, the wind will pick you up and blow you up against the next wave.
One of the best indications you had that you were back on the surface was that you would hear the wind screaming and feel the spray blowing against you.
The spray was so heavy, put your hands over your face like this to breathe.
As the hours passed on December 18th, the men tried to figure out ways to conserve their energy.
Pretty soon learned to roll up in a ball and not fight the water until it quit. The whirlpool let me go.
Archie DeRykere tried repeatedly to grab onto a life raft.
The life raft would come out of the sea, just like an empty bottle surfacing, and it would just become airborne. Oh, I'd say 10, 15, 20 feet in the air. We'd just fly up in the air. And then when we hit, it would knock off the people who were trying to hang on to the life raft. And then they would be scrambling, trying to get back on board. I had hair then. They would be pulling my hair and my eyes and trying to grab your nose or whatever they get hold of, trying to get aboard. I went through this about 3 times, and I decided that I didn't want any more of it, and I left the life raft. And I swam off by myself.
The sailors didn't know how long it would be before help might arrive, or whether it would come at all. As night fell, so did their chances of survival.
It's so big out there, and it's so scary. I was by myself in the middle of the South Pacific, hanging in a life jacket, wondering what's going to happen next. Am I ever going to be seen? Will I drift and drift?
After battling the seas alone for 12 hours, Pat Douhan finally caught sight of other survivors.
I saw this little light bobbing. I yelled, and I heard a voice yelling, "Who is it?" And I said, "It's Pat." Well, it was some of the fellows off our ship in a life raft. And so I made my way over.
They pulled Pat inside the raft, and together the 15 sailors lasted through another night. Their ordeal was far from over. Morning light revealed yet one more danger. In addition to high winds and turbulent seas, the sailors now faced another threat: sharks.
The first thing we saw that next morning was dorsal fins. They were 12 to 14 feet long sharks, and they circled. Every once in a while, they'd make a pass and turn over like they were going to go at us. They could have very easily at any time come in there and just got our legs without any problem at all.
I heard this swish. I looked around. It was this big old fin, this old shark fin. I mean, it was a big one. And he was circling me. I said, you know, God, I said, first you sink my ship. I said, then you have me swim in this ocean all night. And now you're going to feed me to the sharks. I said, that just ain't right.
Hunger, exhaustion, fear. Time passed slowly. Ray Schultz thought of his young bride back in California.
I just wondered what my family was going to do and what they were going to think, and just try hard to make it.
The worst of the typhoon had passed, but hundreds of men remained stranded in the water. By nightfall on December 18, 1944, the typhoon that had ripped through the U.S. Navy's Third Fleet in the South Pacific was finally losing strength. Admiral Bull Halsey shuddered at the news that 4 of his ships, with hundreds of sailors aboard, were missing. He immediately alerted the fleet to be on the lookout for survivors. One of the missing ships was the USS Tabarer, a destroyer escort that had managed to stay afloat during the typhoon. But she had lost her mast and all radio communication. The crew went to work on repairs.
First job they had to do was to rig an antenna so we could communicate by radio.
While up on deck rigging the emergency antenna, Chief Radio Man Ralph Tucker saw a small flicker of light in the water.
And he thought he heard a voice, so he yelled out, "Man overboard." We didn't know where anybody was, and we couldn't see very far.
Battling rain and towering waves, the ship zeroed in on the flickering light. They got close enough to determine there was a sailor in the water. He was wearing a life jacket equipped with a single-cell flashlight and whistle.
With the waves so high, you would only see that man's little flashlight maybe 1 second out of 10, because he was riding the waves too.
They struggled to move the ship into position so they could scoop the man out of the water. Once close enough, they threw the sailor a rope.
So when the ship rolled towards him, they heaved on that line and pulled him right to the ship.
The Tabarer had rescued its first survivor from the hull, Second-Class Petty Officer A.R. Lindquist.
That was the first that we had known that a destroyer had sunk or any ship had sunk. That's the first thought I had. If there's one here, there's more.
So the Tabarer continued her rescue mission.
We had cargo nets thrown over the side, and then as we rolled, guys would go down the cargo nets or into the water and get him on the cargo nets and climb back on board.
Within an hour and a half, 11 men were pulled from the sea, all survivors of the USS Hull. Henry Plage took an extraordinary risk. He turned on his searchlights. It was a move that could expose the Tabby to Japanese subs.
I had 2 lights that were turned on. Of course, I thought about the submarines, but I figured that a submarine in this storm would not be on the surface where he could see us. He would be deep, where it's not stormy.
His instincts were right. The Tabarer picked up more sailors. By the next morning, the rough water and strong winds had scattered the men. Archie DeRykere, who was floating alone in the water, remembers the relief he felt when he finally saw the Tabarer in the distance.
I could see that the smoke from his stack going in one direction, and then he would obviously turn toward us, and then go back the other direction. He did this a few times, and he was getting fairly close.
DeRykere began to splash and holler.
Then the Tabor came alongside, and the glorious crew of the Tabor, they had their divers, their swimmers in the water, swimming around, helping pull us aboard.
Buoyed by the excitement of being rescued, DeRykere didn't realize how fatigued his body was.
They always ask each man, "Are you all right? Can you walk?"
And I said, "Oh yeah, I'm fine," and let go of me, and I fell right down on the deck.
All through that morning, the Tabor plucked men out of the water. At 1 p.m. on the 19th, with his radio communications now repaired, Plage got a message from Admiral Halsey ordering the Tabor to head back to formation so they could survey the ship's damage and start on repairs. Halsey had other rescue ships ready to take over the Tabor's mission. But as Plage started back to the rendezvous point, he spotted more men in the water along the way.
I had a choice to make. I could either go on to the rendezvous and leave possibly more men in the water, or I could stay and try and save another man.
Plage disobeyed Halsey's orders and kept the rescue effort going. 3 hours later, he had rescued 3 more men. But dozens of men, including Pat Douhan and Ray Schultz, were still in the water, uncertain of their fate.
I never thought I had a chance of making it in that water. I didn't think anybody could survive there.
Ray Schultz was floating with 3 fellow sailors when he saw a ship in the distance.
About 5 or 6 that evening, seemed to coming over the horizon. And so I thought it was, first I thought, geez, that's not look like one of the Navy ships. It must be a Japanese.
The ship zeroed in on the men.
I thought, well, we're going to be prisoners. And I heard some guy say, "There's another one over there." And they started firing the machine guns around us. And I thought, oh, hell, they're going to shoot us.
The target wasn't the sailors in the water, but the sharks circling them.
What we did was to break out some rifles and put some guys on the upper deck with rifles, and they would try to keep the sharks away, and they did.
By now, Schultz knew the shooters were his fellow fleet members. He hadn't recognized the Tabor without her mast.
And then they threw me a line. I just tied it around my waist, and they pulled me up on deck.
By the time he was rescued, Schultz had been in the water for 33 hours. He had survived the cruel storm as well as the sharks. Not all the men out on the water were so fortunate.
A tough part of the story is that some of the people they found in life jackets, they would swim out to get them, and they find out that the bottom half was gone, so they would cut them loose and let them go. The sharks had already got them.
Then, with Admiral Halsey's blessing, the Tabor kept at it.
Once we got started doing it, then it became a wonderful chore, you know, to maneuver and hunt for more, and then when you found them, to get them on board. We did it the first night, all the next day, and all the next night.
At 8:40 on the morning of December 20th, the USS Tabor was relieved of her mission by others in the fleet. After working more than 36 hours straight, the Tabby had rescued 55 men. As other ships, such as the USS Brown and the Rudyard Bay, took over, still more men were rescued. Pat Douhan had been in the water for 72 hours when he saw a sign of hope early on December 21st.
It was the USS Brown. When we saw that destroyer coming over the horizon and coming up alongside of it, that was something that is there's no way to express how you feel.
Finally, Douhan's wait in the water was over. He and 12 others in the raft were rescued.
After that many days out with no food or water, we made it.
We didn't talk about whether we were, going to drown or we were going to die. We didn't talk about that. We talked about what we were going to do to live.
I thought, well, I left a wife home pregnant. I got to come out of this. Once you give up hope, that's it. You always have to have hope to survive.
Despite the many dangers the South Pacific presented, its warm, 70-degree water was crucial to the men's survival.
The fact we're in warm water was one of the major factors in all of us surviving.
When the search and rescue mission was called off on December 22nd, a total of 98 men had been saved. Admiral Halsey later asserted that never before in history had a search and rescue mission of such scope been carried out. Despite the valiant efforts, 790 U.S. sailors perished in the typhoon. As the ships gathered at the atoll they used as home base, Bull Halsey knew he would have to answer the inevitable questions of how the Third Fleet had been caught so off guard and who was responsible. But he could never have imagined the next disaster that awaited them. U.S. forces were still waging war in the South Pacific in mid-December 1944, when the Third Fleet regrouped at Ulithi to make repairs. The fleet had been devastated by a killer typhoon. 3 ships capsized. 790 men died. Now, Admiral Bull Halsey had a lot of explaining to do.
After an event where ships are damaged or lost and loss of life is involved, it's appropriate to have a court of inquiry. It's common sense, it's due process.
On December 26th, a formal court of inquiry was convened aboard the USS Cascade to examine the facts. After hearing testimony from 54 witnesses, the court returned the following opinion. The preponderance of responsibility attaches to Commander Third Fleet, Admiral William F. Halsey. The mistakes made were errors in judgment committed under stress of war operations.
Halsey's responsibility was that of the commander who had somehow allowed the conduct of the military mission to obliterate the consideration of the safety of the ships.
Admiral Halsey could have made some perhaps better judgment calls, but he was very successful in accomplishing his basic mission of supporting the invasion of Mindoro, and where this could have been handled better, that's part of the price you pay for being at sea in war.
It was decided that no disciplinary action would be taken.
This was at a critical point in the war. Halsey was a national hero. They did not think that it would serve the purpose of the war effort or of the Navy or of the United States to relieve him.
On the morning of January 3rd, 1945, Admiral Bull Halsey greeted the sailors aboard the newly repaired USS Tabor. On behalf of the Secretary of the Navy, Halsey awarded the crew the Navy Unit Commendation.
They knew they had jobs to do, and so they did them. Many of them risked their lives to help these men in the water, and you can't ask more than that from a man.
The Admiral then pinned the Legion of Merit Cross on the chest of Lieutenant Commander Henry Plage for his heroic leadership in the Tabor's rescue mission. An emotional crew cheered the recognition.
Our guardian angel, Captain Plage, he did this magnificent job, and it's totally in that man's favor that he did this and his crew, because without them, me or my family would not be here today.
I got more respect for Henry Plage than anybody I know.
The giving of self in a harrowing situation like that can't be measured in ribbons or medals or even story. It's the giving of everything you have.
On December 30th, the Third Fleet sailed out of the harbor's safety to return to battle. For the next 5 months, U.S. forces performed heroically at Manila and Iwo Jima. By June, the Third Fleet was providing cover, trying to wrap up the victory of Okinawa. Then on June 3rd, the unthinkable happened. Admiral Halsey was aboard his flagship, the USS Missouri, just off Okinawa, when he received a typhoon warning. With memories of the December typhoon still fresh, Halsey maneuvered the fleet away from the storm. He was careful not to retreat too far from his strategic position. A few hours later, a destroyer sent a critical storm update. The typhoon had changed direction. Once again, the cumbersome decoding process delayed the weather information, and Halsey did not receive the warning. He led his ships directly into the path of the typhoon. This time, however, it was the large ships, or big boys, that caught the brunt of the storm. First Class Petty Officer Frank Gesualdo was aboard the aircraft carrier USS Hornet when the weather started getting rough.
We knew we were in trouble when we were bouncing around the ship. It's like being in an airplane. You hit an air pocket, you drop a few feet, and you wonder what the hell's going on.
Seaman First Class Ralph Hinson remembers the strength of the waves.
You would come out, and then sometimes the ship would be on the top of this wave, and then it would shudder, and then come back down again. Water was everywhere. And those waves were large. They were large.
The men aboard the Hornet did their best to hold on.
You make sure you buckle up your shorts good and tight, and you say your prayers, and you think about Mother, and you say an extra Hail Mary, and let it be.
The crew battled the seas for hours. After the worst had passed, the men were shocked to see just how strong the winds and waves had been. The steel flight deck of their ship was mangled around the bow.
We couldn't figure out flight deck. You know, who can bend a flight deck? It's impossible, but it happened. And if I hadn't seen it, I wouldn't have believed it.
Though this second typhoon was shorter-lived than the first, it ravaged the fleet. 33 ships were damaged, 76 planes destroyed, and 6 sailors killed. Another court of inquiry was assembled. This time the court made a recommendation to relieve Halsey of his command. It was decided that even though the weather information had been delayed, Admiral Halsey had made a grave error by allowing the ships to remain so close to the storm's path. The Secretary of the Navy never acted on the court's recommendation. Halsey remained in command.
After they came out of that second typhoon experience, the Admiral sent a very firmly worded letter strongly recommending that the Navy develop a systematic weather reconnaissance operation to ensure that the fleet will be given better meteorological information in the future.
Thanks in part to Admiral Halsey's insistence, the U.S. Navy instituted regular weather reconnaissance squadrons. Today, the need for storm tracking remains vital to the Navy's ships on active duty around the globe.
Typhoons continue to be, even 50 years later, the biggest challenge for mariners at sea and for the United States Navy.
Modern technology has also helped the U.S. Navy stay a step ahead in the deadly game of outwitting typhoons.
We are very fortunate that today we have the technology that allows us to see where tropical storms may originate and when they do, where they're moving and how intense they are.
At the Joint Typhoon Warning Center in Pearl Harbor, Navy weather experts watch for typhoons over 100 million square miles of open ocean area.
The Joint Typhoon Warning Center is here to distribute bulletins and warnings to the Department of Defense. We run a 24-hour watch. They're 12-hour shifts. I've got 30 people on watch, 3 at a time.
It seems to be working. Today, the U.S. Navy tracks about 75 tropical cyclones a year and issues warnings to the Pentagon. The Navy has managed to avoid repeating the death and destruction that crippled the Third Fleet. But the war between Halsey's fleet and the forces of nature still serves as a powerful reminder.
The Typhoon of '44 presented an enemy that many of the sailors of the Third Fleet had never confronted before. And there was a certain time in every one of those skippers' minds where the enemy was no longer the Japanese.
Battling the elements, you can't fight back. The enemy, you can. I think any one of us who survived would have rather lost our ship in a battle than lost it in a typhoon.
But there was no question that day. The forces of nature were the enemy. Nature's the winner all the time. You can't beat it.